Since I know you from the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, but I never really asked you, when exactly did you get interested in Asia? I'd like to ask you if you can briefly introduce yourself and why you're doing what you're doing right now. And also, since you're here and we're just so delighted as ASPE family that you're here, if you can tell us or remind us how special Asia Society and Asia Society Policy Institute is. And also tell us a little bit about the Center for China Analysis, because that's something that most of the audience here are not that aware of. So thank you. Please. So first, how did you get interested in Asia?
Thank you so much, Takako, and thanks to Asia Society Japan for hosting me today. I'm delighted to be here and to meet some of you in person, and thank you to the people who are also joining us online. So I got interested in Asia primarily through learning the Chinese language. My career actually started in Hollywood. I was a screenwriting undergrad and worked in the entertainment industry for several years. But when I decided that career was not for me, I went back to language school and started learning Chinese and suddenly realized that there was this whole very interesting world and career on international politics and international relation, a subject I had studied in undergraduate and really enjoyed, but was quite focused at the time on making my path in the entertainment industry. But what I found, of course, is that a lot of the skills that I developed in one industry are very applicable across the board. Now, at Asia Society in New York, I'm the managing director of the Policy Institute, as Takako-san mentioned. We work as a think and do tank. So we try to focus on problems with a solution-oriented mandate. We're not just studying an issue, researching and providing recommendation, but we do a fair amount of policy advocacy as well, talking to policymakers in the US and Asia about how to turn those recommendations into actionable policy guidance. We work, as Takako mentioned, across security, trade, and climate, and I manage the strategy and operations for all of those teams. We also have recently launched the Center for China Analysis. So in October last year, we opened a specific China research hub within the Asia Society Policy Institute, where we focus on China from the inside out. So everyone who is affiliated with the Center for China Analysis is fluent in Mandarin. We try to use those language skills to better explain to the world what is going on inside of China by looking at research in the Mandarin language. And we do that across a number of pillars, including society, as well as domestic politics, economics, security, and global public health. So what we're trying to do is not just to be very narrowly focused on one lane of what's going on in China, but to think a little bit more deeply about how all of the different pieces fit together. And I think that covers all your questions, but I'm happy to explain anything a little further in Q&A.
Yes, I think you covered all my questions, and also we know a lot more about what kind of background you have, and also the focus of analysis. And actually, I should say the focus of breadth of the analysis at the Center for China Analysis. So thank you for that. So I guess we should turn and jump into the topic of the day. So how exactly can we manage China's rise without war?
Yes, it's a big topic that I myself set. So I'll go through a couple of thoughts that I have on this topic, and then again, happy to answer questions. I'm going to structure my remarks by first going over where I think we are today in U.S. China relations, then discuss the role of U.S. alliances, and then hopefully in questions, we can also talk a little bit about Taiwan. I'll highlight some of my recommendations to policymakers throughout the talk, but I'm also happy to touch on North Korea as well if there's interest. So first, let me start by saying that U.S.-China relations are in an extremely fragile state right now. Both sides have introduced the concept that the bilateral relationship is primarily defined by strategic competition. But that thought of what strategic competition is, what we're competing over, what it looks like to win a competition, how we should, develop rules and modalities for waging a fair and equitable competition against each other is very, very undefined. And then we have the lines between our domestic political environment in both countries and international relations becoming quite blurry. So when you look at the concept of strategic competition, it's very much a tangled knot, and it's very difficult to figure out what string to pull in order to analyze it most effectively. Both sides are now messaging to their domestic audiences that the other side is an existential threat. And I think that this is particularly dangerous. And I think that the conclusion rests on some very shaky policy assumptions that ought to be more closely examined. So let me lay out what I think both sides are saying about each other. And I want to start by saying I don't agree or disagree with either of these characterizations, but this is what I'm seeing as the dominant narrative on both sides. So the Washington, D.C. narrative on China goes something like this. Mistakes were made in the U.S. policy community from about the year 2000 to approximately 2015 to assist China in joining the WTO under a very flawed assumption that as China liberalized its economy, it would become a responsible stakeholder in the international system. However, as the DC narrative goes, China chose instead to convert its economic strength into coercive uses of power and pursue revisionist goals in Asia and around the world to exempt itself from rules of the international order that it had signed up to when it joined the WTO, and particularly to strengthen its state market system in ways that were contrary to those economic rules. These unfair economic practices hurt U.S. competitiveness and gave China unfair leverage to use its economic strength and as carrots and sticks to attempt to dominate Asia, all while increasing political repression at home and violating international human rights norms and values. So instead of a rising China shaping itself in the image of the United States, the U.S. instead created Frankenstein's monster by giving China all of the tools and power it needed to challenge U.S. dominance in the international system. And therefore, the only path available to the U.S. is to course correct by first acknowledging that strategic competition is the state of affairs that we are in, whether we like it or not. And second, to prosecute that strategic competition to the fullest extent of our power across all domains, including political, military, and economic. That's obviously a very dire picture of where we are today and what the U.S. needs to do in order to maintain its own strategic competitiveness. But that gravity and that pessimistic view of the other side is echoed in Beijing's narrative. So I'll now lay out Beijing's narrative, noting again that I take no position on this. Beijing's narrative goes something like this. China never promised and would never promise to become more like the U.S. through economic liberalization, and it will follow its own unique development path that asserts strong Communist Party control over society, from economics to politics, and of course in the military. China achieved its rise of its own accord, and it does not owe any political changes to the rest of the world. China's rise is enabling it to take its historical and rightful place in Asia as the most powerful nation in Asia, and it's in a powerful nation in the world. But the U.S. and the U.S. allies want to encircle China and contain its rise. China does not follow the path of the U.S. in interfering in other countries' domestic affairs, and the U.S. has no right to use China's governance systems or China's relationship with its own neighbors as a card to attack China. And because the U.S. and its allies are hostile to China's core interests, including reuniting with Taiwan, reclaiming maritime territory, and maintaining a one-party system, China has no choice but to dare to struggle and to prepare for intense competition, confrontation, and conflict. China has done nothing wrong except to grow stronger, and the strength frightens the U.S. and its allies, who are acting from a place of anxiety to prevent China from taking this rightful role. So that's our starting point of how we are looking at bilateral relations. There's almost no official communication happening between the two sides, because both sides are very locked into these narratives. And the narratives do actually have a lot in common. Both sides see the other as responsible for the current state of affairs, and they are not self-reflective of their own positions, mistakes, or missteps in managing this bilateral relationship responsibly. Both sides say that they'll work together where their interests align, but they cannot find a way to prioritize those common interests over some of these areas of competition and disagreement. And both sides are using the bad intentions of the other to explain or excuse some of their own failures of domestic governance and to exempt themselves selectively from the rules of the international system. So we've come to a place where both sides say that they want to compete, cooperate, and confront where necessary, but there's been no sort of bilateral conversation or new ideas introduced into this conversation that show us how to separate out these issues into three separate buckets that we could work on simultaneously. And actually, instead of categorizing, one narrative or the other as wrong or bad, I would say that these narratives display aspects of great power behavior that do not mix well without sustained attention to managing this bilateral relationship, and without, deep confidence in our own systems. So is China an existential threat to the United States? Is the U.S. an existential threat to China? I think that's the first set of policy assumptions that need to be examined, because the truth is that both countries have deep and enduring strengths of their own, and the likeliest future is one where both sides need to coexist in some manner. So, in terms of ways that, I see this kind of lack of confidence or lack of direction, major power behavior manifesting, one is that the U.S. could not join TPP. And has gone back and forth on the value of international institutions as a venue for solving problems. It's often very frustrated by the constraints placed on its own power inside these international institutions. Both sides are looking out into the world and interpreting what I would argue is normal balancing behavior against the coercive use of power as being directed by the other side. And far from a strategic competitor, both sides are now labeling each other as a strategic threat. So when the bilateral relationship was a little less dire and communication was happening in many different forms, it was already very difficult to manage this relationship responsibly. We have two very complex societies. We have two very large bureaucracies that had trouble communicating because of extremely different operating systems. And not only is the hardware different in that we have different types of ministries and departments, and responsibilities are not equally shared across equivalent kind of bureaucratic institutions, the software was also extremely different. The U.S. officials were more free to negotiate in a room. The Chinese often needed this top-level guidance in order to make progress on an issue. So those differences had, by the time that Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, already led to a lot of fatigue and distrust in dealing with each other that I think both sides used to try to mitigate, to fight against, but now are leaning into this fatigue and distrust to jump to conclusions about the other side that support the political narratives that I laid out above. And so, I think the balloon incident illustrates some of this, and we can discuss that a little further. How do allies fit into this picture? And I think U.S. allies have probably the most important role in the entire international system right now when it comes to managing China's rise without war. I have 4 suggestions for things that allies could do in this situation where the U.S. and China are not only not talking to each other, but they're continuously feeding facts and figures into these political narratives that will prevent reconciliation in the future. So 4 things allies can do. The first is to really be a bridge between the U.S. and China to fill this communications gap. I think that allies can play a critical role in explaining a fuller context behind decisions both sides are making, and information that allies could give to each side could lower the temperature at critical inflection points. Second, question these policy assumptions. I think it's really critically important that both sides are scoping threats accurately and thoroughly exploring a correct prioritization between areas of common or even global interest and areas of intense disagreement and anxiety. I think that U.S. allies and collectively middle powers and smaller powers throughout the world need to hold both sides to common rules and standards. For example, it's very disingenuous for the U.S. to promote a system of friendshoring and other disruptions in the global supply chain alongside some of the U.S.'s own new industrial policies and barriers to trade created at home. And likewise, China needs to account for its continued economic coercion and to recognize that pushback against its practices are not directed by the United States and its allies, but are common to balancing behavior throughout the system. And that leads me to my last point, somewhat similar, which is to kind of lead a middle power coalition to balance against great power behavior. I think Japan is doing already a very excellent job on this front between fostering the CPTPP and making sure that strategic trade agreements can be entered into, especially in Asia. Japan's participation and motivations to join and lead some areas of the Quad initiative between the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. Enhanced military relationships that Japan is driving with key U.S. allies, the new redefinition of Japan's relationship with South Korea, although I'm sure there are a range of opinions on how enduring that will be. I think it's significant that it's happening. And then, of course, as Takako-san mentioned, Kishida's visit to see President Zelensky in Ukraine. This is all critically important as the U.S. enters another precarious election season that could see another very hard swing against international cooperation. So I think I'll stop my formal remarks there and turn to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an excellent overview and starting point, and for I'm hoping for an engaging discussion today. But let me first ask you about the balloon incident. I was just happened to be in the U.S., and I'm not really sure how it was reported here, but I think it made people who are concerned about the nature of the discussion right now in the U.S. really worried about how things might go with more interest domestically. That could lead to more of the fear that might lead to more, maybe not like actual, but more of a symbolic or image of the China to be something of dire consequences, an existential threat in a way that was a bit different before the balloon incident. So one, to what extent do you think it's going to be, looking back, an important event? It has been some time, and I think people tended to be more worried about it being some kind of a big thing, and maybe people are starting to forget about that. But what do you think, and how do you see how it evolved over time in terms of the narrative? I think it's been a couple of weeks since that happened now, right? Mm-hmm. And how do you see how things are, and how do you see the two governments, how they dealt with the incident? Like, do you feel more reassured or more worried about the communication between the countries after that incident?
Well, I think maybe I have two bottom lines up front on this. The first is that I think this is indicative of how regular great power behavior is being looked at as a strategic threat between the U.S. and China. So surveillance programs, I think, are run throughout the world. It's something that's known but not acknowledged, that many countries have different types of surveillance programs. The U.S. has many in the Asian region, including ones that China has long considered a threat to its own strategic interest. China also now, as a rising major power, is running its own surveillance programs. And the second bottom line is that this incident really hardened views on both sides along the lines of some of the analysis that I laid out before, and I'll just briefly dive into that, and then we can talk about communications. So, what the balloon incident did in the United States was to really merge that blurry line between domestic politics and international politics. It's one thing to have U.S. government officials come out and say China's surveillance is a problem, and quite another to have this very large visual of what that surveillance program might look like flying over the United States for 2.5 days. In the media, in the news cycle that we live in, that provided this just constant fodder to talk about China's surveillance programs. And there were a lot of different people who have been worried about Chinese surveillance, not some sort of surveillance blimp, but the surveillance that is common to, carrying our electronic devices everywhere, to TikTok, to the 5G system, that were ready to speak about those issues when the news cycle allowed them to be brought up. So that's, the first point is that this really created in the American psyche a visual representation of things that they had been hearing about for a long time, but seemed very abstract until this incident. Second point, perhaps, is that I'll wait and reserve my opinion of whether or not this is a significant turning point in U.S. China relations until we see if Secretary Blinken's trip can be rescheduled. So the major outcome of the balloon incident was less the flying of the balloon over the United States and the eventual shooting down of the balloon. Again, a very newsworthy, camera-ready type of event to end this balloon saga. But it was really that the Secretary of State was unable to go to Beijing and take part in some of the meetings that were designed to come to the terms to better manage strategic competition. And we're still waiting for that meeting to be rescheduled. I think that, from the Chinese perspective, the meeting between President Xi and President Biden in Bali in November was meant to set a path under which these other meetings could be held and the relationship could be put on a more even keel. But it's simply, the balloon incident did derail that because there was no politically palatable way in America's domestic system for Secretary Blinken to go to Beijing while there was a surveillance balloon flying over the United States. So from the Chinese side, I think they're quite disappointed. I don't think that they expected the reaction that they got when this balloon, either went off course intentionally or unintentionally, and no one knows whether it was intentional or unintentional or how it worked in the system. But it did illustrate how the types of asks that each side have of the other really don't fit the political system and bureaucracies that each side has. So from the U.S. perspective, the U.S. has been asking for some time for hotlines so that during times of crisis or major international incidents, someone as senior as the Secretary of Defense could pick up a phone and talk to his or her, his in this case, counterpart. And what happened was that the U.S., picked up the phone and called and got no answer for over 48 hours. And the question that I have then is, was that a useful and appropriate ask? I understand that it meets the goals of the U.S. to be able to have a direct conversation with somebody in times of crisis. But if you understand the Chinese political system, you would think that something as major as an incident of this magnitude, there's no real room for Chinese officials to freelance on the response. That response needs to be run through the Chinese political system, probably in this case, all the way up to the top and back down. And that type of communication process and bureaucratic process takes time. So it's not something that you can answer the phone and have a quick, and ready response for. Likewise, I think China was very disappointed that the U.S. couldn't just kill this news story. It really doesn't understand fundamentally the free media system in the United States and the domestic political environment. China really loves working with other authoritarian countries because in those cases, the governments can absorb all of the irritants that might come from, China's activities in that country, whatever they may be. And the fact that the U.S. can't do these types of things, can't kill the balloon incident in some way that allows this meeting for Secretary Blinken to take place, can't otherwise stop U.S. political actors from doing things that are contrary to China's interest. Maybe the most major ask in recent months has been, please stop Speaker of the House McCarthy from visiting Taiwan. And the fact that the U.S. government simply doesn't work in that type of top-down authoritarian system really frustrates the Chinese. I do think that this balloon incident does magnify to a degree the dynamics behind U.S.-China relations right now. And unfortunately, it leaves me more worried than reassured that we can, responsibly manage this relationship moving forward.
Thank you. So when we talk about what we're worried about, I think the bigger flashpoint that we're worried about tends to be more about Taiwan, which also happens to be very close to Japan. So what's your take on Taiwan and what you've been observing in the past couple of years? Because we do see a lot of worries about Taiwan, a lot of different timelines presented by different military leaders, and we're not too sure how to make of all that. So what's your take on Taiwan and where things are?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. This is a subject that's very close to my heart, having worked on it for over a decade now, and seeing how the cross-Taiwan Strait relationship is again magnifying some of these strategic trends, also playing into a security dilemma between the U.S. and China, where actions taken by one side that they see as defensive are interpreted as offensive by the other side. And we're very much in a reaction spiral around Taiwan that I think is very, very dangerous for the region and the world. All of the lines of U.S.-China strategic competition intersect in Taiwan. So if you want to talk about strategic competition about values, you have a very deep divide between the U.S., Taiwan on one side, their democratic systems, and China on the other side, its authoritarian state party system. Taiwan is an area that touches on China's core interests. Of course, China claims Taiwan as part of its sovereign territory and sees the U.S. as the primary impediment to achieving its goal of unification. And then there's also technology competition and Taiwan's role in technology competition as the entity that houses some very important advanced semiconductor manufacturing. And semiconductors in their role will, be a major part of economic competition and eventually, some sort of economic dominance throughout the next century. So Taiwan is critically important, not just in and of itself, but it also has all of these different facets of U.S.-China strategic competition wrapped up inside it. I think that, the U.S. really sees itself as a protector of Taiwan, and particularly the U.S. Congress. The story of U.S.-Taiwan unofficial relations is that when, the executive branch of the U.S. government, which is responsible for foreign policy and official relations with other countries, switched recognition from Taipei to Beijing, Congress stepped up to protect Taipei and Taiwan. And by passing the Taiwan Relations Act and ensuring that the U.S. could support Taiwan militarily through, of course, arms of a defensive nature, but also through political support, Congress became, Taiwan's protector in the U.S. domestic political system. But I would argue that, outside of that, the U.S.-Taiwan relations has less to do with strategic competition between the U.S. and China, and more to do with China's behavior toward Taiwan since Tsai Ing-wen came to power in 2016. Of course, Tsai is the leader of the party in Taiwan that has an independence plank in their party platform. And Beijing's bottom line on Taiwan is that it should not declare or be recognized as independent. So that's created a situation between Taipei and Beijing where the two sides are no longer able to talk to each other. They'd previously been talking to each other, even signing economic agreements for several years before she came to power. And when Beijing and Taipei are not talking, the U.S. plays an outside role in the strategic triangle that's most important to determining Taiwan's future status, which is between Washington, Beijing, and Taipei. However, Beijing, of course, as part of the security dilemma, sees U.S. actions of support for Taiwan, again, actions that I believe are balancing against China's coercive behavior, as a direct threat to its own political legitimacy, and is directed by a hostile intent from Washington to Beijing, rather than a reflection of a hostile intent from Beijing to Taipei. And U.S. assertions of support for Taiwan have created some contradictions in U.S. policy toward Taiwan. So I'll talk about timelines in a second, but first I just want to briefly lay out the U.S. position on the issue of Taiwan. And that's that the U.S. supports any political resolution to cross-strait relations that is reached without the use of force or coercion. And the U.S. finds itself in a bit of a bind because of Beijing's use of force and coercion to settle this issue. The U.S. has had to step in and balance that force and coercion by strengthening U.S.-Taiwan relations. So it's created a bit of a contradiction where the U.S. has become a player and a force of military support for Taiwan in ways that almost run contrary to its own policy, but it sees no other way to fulfill its commitments to Taiwan in the face of Beijing's aggression. It's important to remember that despite the tone of this presentation and how pessimistic I am about all of the challenges that confront us, the bottom line on Taiwan has actually held for some time. And the bottom line, I think, is this. Taipei does not and will not declare formal de jure independence. Beijing reserves the use of force only in the case of Taiwan declaring formal de jure independence, and the U.S. wants the issue resolved without force or coercion. And to a certain extent, that bottom line of the declaration of independence has held for some time. It remains to be seen how durable that line will be in the future as Taiwan goes through its own election process. And Beijing has also, in its formal law to govern use of force over Taiwan, the anti-secession law, has outlined that it would also reserve the right to use force if Taiwan became permanently separate and there was no path to peaceful unification. And I think we're headed more toward that direction, which is very dangerous and frightening, frankly, because it relies on Beijing's interpretation of where this issue might go in the future. And that is something that is very difficult to shape or control from outside the system. In terms of timelines, I think it's very important to remember that the U.S. military, when it talks about timelines regarding, Beijing's invasion or use of force against Taiwan, it's speaking to its own domestic audience just as much as it is speaking to an accurate prediction in international relations. I think that the U.S. military is charged with being able to defend Taiwan in some form or fashion that would be But in order to do that, it needs to create urgency in the system to get the things that it needs to defend Taiwan. And that, to me, is where all of these different timelines come into play. It's not so much that the U.S. can look at the future of the world and say, this will definitively happen in 2026 or 2027, but they can say, we believe that China's military is on a modernization path that would make it very difficult for us to plan for this type of contingency in 2026, 27 without XYZ support. And that's where I think the timeline, really becomes an issue, not so much of prediction, but of military strategic planning. There's no timeline, I think, in Beijing's mind on Taiwan. There's only this red line, which is a declaration of Taiwan independence. And there's simply, no way for the U.S. to predict if, when Beijing would use force against Taiwan. We can only predict if, when Beijing will have the power to do so in ways that complicate the U.S.'s ability to bring about a peaceful outcome.
I should open for a question, but I'm just going to plug one more question as moderator. So you mentioned the role of allies. And so when we're thinking about these issues, what can other countries do is very important. And also we're at a point where in Japan, the new fiscal year and academic year starts in April. Cherry blossoms are a sign that we're entering a new year. So we'd like to ask you what to look forward to in your head, especially with regards to multinational, multilateral endeavors. And I'd like to ask you about Japan it's a very important year for Japan hosting the G7. And that, and Japan likes to call itself a bridge in different ways between the G7 countries, G20, and somehow, although Japan is a lot closer to the U.S., still a bridge between the two great powers, if possible. Mm-hmm. So what do you think of Japan's role going ahead? And also just kind of as a plug, Asia Society did a really excellent overview of different multilateral efforts last year. And you have senior fellows like myself in India and Australia as well. So looking forward, what you would say that we might be able to contribute in somewhat differently from other think tanks that looking forward for this season or this 1 year of diplomacy in Asia going ahead?
Oh, thank you. That's an excellent question. I think that this is the year of Asian leadership in a lot of multilateral institutions. So I'm very excited to see how Japan's stewardship of the G7 develops and how India's stewardship of the G20 develops. I think Japan and India are both quite unique in playing that bridging role, not just between East and West or between, alliances and non-aligned movements, but also between the developed and the developing world. I know Japan has a real track record of excellence in Southeast Asia and other areas of the global South. Where it's, really fostered some unique and successful development programs. Japan doesn't often get, I think, enough attention for the work that it does on infrastructure issues, on global public health, and on development finance. The conversation is always about China and China's activities, whereas Japan actually has a much bigger and longer, and I believe more enduring presence in these areas. At the Asia Society Policy Institute and at Asia Society as a whole, we're looking at the last quarter of our own fiscal year, and in July we'll switch to a new fiscal year. So we're also looking forward to a change from a spotlight on India, which we've had for the last year, to a spotlight on Japan. And alongside Asia Society Japan, the Policy Institute is very pleased to take part in highlighting some of Japan's successes, hopefully, successes that come out of the G7, including perhaps, successes on pledges for nuclear nonproliferation. I think that is going to be a very tricky but important topic this year, especially in light of Russia's decision to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, and the how to deal with these violations of international norms and rules that that all the nuclear powers had signed up to. I think Japan can play a very important role in that. We're also, looking forward to, as you noted, we have fellows. We have you, of course, Takako-san in Japan. We have Raja Mohan in India. It's one of India's foremost strategic thinkers. Richard Maud in Australia, who is a former government official and also very adept at looking at Australia's role in the world. And then, of course, we have our vice presidents in New York and DC, Danny Russell and Wendy Cutler, who are experts in their own right on security and trade issues. Over the next year, we're going to spend a lot of attention focused on what I see as our competitive strength, which is that we have fellows in each of the Quad countries. So looking at how the Quad develops as a mini-lateral institution and how the agreements reached between the Quad members, even the focus of their issues in minilateralism, plays into these larger multilateral groupings, including the G20, G7, the UN General Assembly and other major summits, ASEAN summit as well. I think that it will be a big area of focus for us, and an area that deserves quite a bit of attention. If we're moving toward a more multipolar world, we should expect to see more of these types of mini-lateral coalitions popping up, and how they feed back into the larger global institutions is going to be really critical for shaping the norms, rules, and values that govern our system as a whole.
Thank you. So we enjoyed her expertise, but I also wanted to highlight that you're an extremely effective and very much a leader from within the Asia Society as a managing director. And I think you saw glimpses of that in her last part, that we're trying to come up with what we can do, which is very unique going forward, looking at not just this year, but year ahead in this area of maybe strategic competition. I think there's a very important role for Asia Society to play. So thank you. And that I'd like to open now for questions. And also I'd like to invite the online audience. I hear that we have quite a large audience online today, so I'd like to open for questions there. So please.
Thank you. Takahito from Sophia University. Just relating to your previous statement, U.S. and Japan developing international relations with less developing nations. It seems that Japan has used a JICA. U.S. also used U.S. aid to support many less developing nations. However, China has invested more direct investment on infrastructures in less developing countries. Do you think Japan and the United States should change the style of assistance to less developing nations through diplomatic relations more aggressively to invest on public infrastructure? Or should we utilize institutional partnerships such as higher education institutions or research institutions? What do you think the upcoming collaborations with less developing countries for the United States and Japan? Thank you.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. So I think that, as you rightly pointed out, there is this big disconnect between what China is investing in the developing countries and what the U.S. and Japan can or should do. I think that the U.S. and Japan are probably not going to be able to compete with China on volume, but we can compete on quality. And not only that, the U.S. and Japan's experience over a very long term of investing in developing countries lends itself to improving the quality even of Chinese infrastructure projects by, providing services that are desperately needed. Even just by making sure that recipient countries are aware of international best standards and practices. At the Asia Society Policy Institute, I'm very pleased that we have worked on what we call a toolkit for the Belt and Road projects. And that provides in local languages in Southeast Asia primarily, timelines, step-by-step guidelines, documentation on what communities who are affected poorly by Belt and Road projects can do. in order to get their grievances addressed. So that timeline is available on our website, asiasociety.org. It's called our Belt and Road Toolkit. It is available in multiple languages. It's also available in low bandwidth format. So if you're a farmer in Indonesia that has a pollution problem on your land due to a Belt and Road Initiative project, you can get on your cell phone, find the people that you need to talk to, find out what the international best practices are, and start working through the checklist of how to get your problem addressed. And we have actually found that when institutions such as ourselves work on these issues from a constructive standpoint, that the Chinese are actually quite welcoming of this initiative. So we have this toolkit translated into Mandarin as well, and it has been received positive feedback from China as well. So China, it looks as though it has this omnipotent government that can reach everywhere and direct everything. But of course, it's a massive country with a lot of institutions that are often working at cross purposes. And to the extent that the U.S. and Japan can work constructively on helping the Chinese government improve its own governance standards, I think the benefits will accrue to the developing world and make a better investment environment for the U.S. and Japan over time.
Ms. Daniels, can we talk a little bit about Russia? I thought your analysis of the problems of America's view of China and China's view of America was very profound. Maybe a little less open to the idea that there are lots of people in China who understand when America's in an election year. We seem to always be in an election year these days, but in an election year, and so that American policy is sensitive to public opinion. In that context, how could they possibly think that aligning with Russia would be helpful to them in the world?
Right. Well, it depends on what you think their definition of helpful is, right? So I don't think that Beijing is in a place right now where it's prioritizing its relationship with the U.S. over other strategic goals, partly for the reason that you rightly mentioned, which is that the U.S. is in this kind of perpetual domestic election season that creates a lot of risk for other countries. So from my perspective, I think that, Beijing's alignment with Russia is and this is not just my perspective, but that of the U.S. government spokespeople, a marriage of convenience. What does China get out of a relationship with Russia, despite all of the problems that it creates in U.S.-China relations? One, it gets an alignment of its position that the U.S. and its allies are targeting those alliances towards third countries in an unfair way. So it gets a little bit of juice on this victimization narrative that it has been pushing for some time that helps it explain some of its governance failures at home. Second, it gets a economically beneficial relationship with Russia at rock bottom prices. So without, actually violating any of the sanctions or rules that the U.S. has set up, China is able to take advantage of Russia's isolation in the international financial system to get a good deal on, right now, I think it's LNG. And a second pipeline being built, but over time to kind of continue that the leverage that the U.S. has now provided to China by isolating Russia. And then, but where I do think that China is is a little bit more circumspect. And what did surprise me out of the visit of President Xi to Moscow is that I think that China, while it's kind of written off the United States as a country that it can ever work with, is very concerned about its relationship with Europe. Europe remains one of China's top export markets. Europe remains a very important, strategic entity in a multipolar world. And I think that China has undervalued how its alignment with Russia through the Ukraine crisis has hardened positions in Europe that China is not a country with which it can work in any capacity. I think it simply underestimates, what Europe's all of Europe's feelings and interest in pushing Russia back out of Ukraine. I do think that China probably did come to Russia with at least some of its own ideas of how the war could grind at least to a halt, if not be eventually resolved. But the fact that there was no
announcement.
No content in the joint statement on Ukraine makes me think that China and Russia were not able to reach an agreement on that. You could always assume that China didn't try hard enough, and it would be a fair assumption to make. But let's be sure that it is indeed an assumption. We don't know what was discussed between China and Russia. The best possible outcome for China remains that the Russia-Ukraine conflict ends and Russia remains isolated in the international financial system. So I do think they were probably pushing toward that goal, but was not achieved at this trip. And what happens with Russia in Europe is going to have, I think, profound effects on how Europe sees China, and over time could turn a marriage of convenience into something a little bit deeper and more sustaining.
My name is Cece Xu, and I'm from the most dangerous place in the world, Taiwan. Actually, my question is in the title of your presentation, the word war. And of course, we all know, the most likely scenario for a war between the United States and China is over Taiwan. And I would like to have your ideas on the role of the media in all of this, because the reason I mentioned Taiwan being the most dangerous place in the world is because last April, The Economist, which is a very well-respected magazine, had a cover story with a map of Taiwan and a periscope mark, and with a screaming headline, "Taiwan, the most dangerous place in the world." And we lived in Taiwan. We were totally puzzled, and even really in the post-Nancy Pelosi visit, when China was conducting all kinds of military exercises around Taiwan, there was absolutely no panic, zero panic in Taiwan. So is it very much driven by the media? Because I think in Taiwan, we don't see it as there's no panic at all.
Yeah. That's a great question, and I appreciate it. I'll start by saying that The Economist often delivers these very striking covers. I will draw everyone's attention to, I think it was in 2015, President Xi and President Obama had a summit in the United States, and The Economist put them in the Brokeback Mountain movie poster as like two lovers. I mean, it was very odd. So we'll leave The Economist and their odd decision-making on covers aside. But I do think that it's, to address the point behind your question on the role of the media, I do think it is playing a bit of an outsized role. The media loves to, obviously work people into creating emotional reactions to the situations that are around us and to current events. I recognize that on Taiwan, there are very few people who are deeply concerned about the prospects of a Chinese invasion. And I have mixed feelings about that, honestly. I do think this is really the area that is most likely to spark a U.S. China armed conflict. And so there is, I hope that there will be a recognition over time in Taiwan that that is not a strategic impossibility, that it could happen, and that therefore, Taiwan needs to prepare as best it can for it. On the other hand, I think that it's instructive to remember that, that Taiwan has a lot more experience than the United States in dealing with its neighbor across the strait. And that, to a certain extent, if the nonchalance of the Taiwan people can lower the temperature of the media a little bit, that would be a very good trend. It strikes me that the people in Ukraine did not think that Russia would invade until missiles were raining down. And I think that there's probably a balance to strike here between being completely histrionic and, overly preparing in ways that actually provoke or spark more conflict, and being realistic about the possibility of a Chinese use of force. However, as Taiwan well knows, there are tons of options for China to take outside of an invasion of Taiwan. We do have a paper up right now, I believe, on the Asia Society Policy Institute's website that goes over different contingencies outside of a full invasion, including perhaps Beijing taking some of Taiwan's outlying islands. So obviously Taiwan has main island, has a lot of maritime territory around it. And those are the types of things that are probably, more realistic to come to pass in the next, let's say, several decades than an outright invasion. I'm not sure I've totally answered your question, but those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Rorry. I don't need to speak on behalf of the economists, but I think the cover for the either ongoing or last week is also Taiwan. I picked it up at the airport, and I think the argument there was a lot more careful and nuanced and worried than otherwise.
Yes, I just have one simple question. Does Xi Jinping control the PLA in your mind? Would the PLA be able to go rogue in the absence of robust institutions that actually need top-down directions before they constrain themselves or decide which direction to go in the moment of a crisis?
Yeah. You say that's a simple question, but it's actually quite complex. So I'll do my best to try to answer. And again, I don't know what's in Xi Jinping's mind, and I can only observe patterns in Chinese governance. I can't say what's absolutely happening. The system is so opaque that I think that you should distrust anyone who tells you that they know what's going on inside the top echelons of the Chinese government, particularly whether or not they have control over the PLA. But I'll give you some thoughts I have on the subject. I do think that President Xi is in control of the PLA. But I also believe that guidance in the Chinese system can be sometimes subject to interpretation in ways that could spark an unintended conflict. So let's say Xi Jinping says, make sure that the Taiwan Air Force knows we're out there. Individual pilots have to make decisions in the cockpit about what that looks like, perhaps. So there is some room for error in, the game of telephone that is played from the top leadership all the way down the line. I think the Chinese are sensitive to that margin of error, and they do create systems inside their governance structure, particularly in the military, to make sure that directives aren't misinterpreted. But on the other hand, China has sparked and provoked a lot of nationalism, particularly among its youth. And, we've seen incidents over the past year where pilots who made risky maneuvers, or even, Navy captains who did risky things, were celebrated in the Chinese media for taking on big risks. So that is somewhat concerning, particularly when it comes to Taiwan, that the incentive structure inside China is moving in directions that would increase that margin for error instead of decreasing it.
So Xi changed the law to have his third term, which is similar to Putin. Is Xi's ambitions taking a serious concern similar to Putin?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of that question?
Is Xi's ambitions taking as serious concerns similar to Putin's?
Okay, well, I do think that the two systems, the system that Putin has created inside Russia and the system that Xi Jinping is creating inside China, have a lot of similarities. They obviously have the sense that there is a personality at the top that is best placed to lead the country through this period. In China, they call it the period unseen in 100 years, which really just means like the changes in balance of power inside the international system that create opportunities for China's rise and also create many challenges. They come from similar, philosophical traditions in some ways. You could, certainly spend more than the next 5 to 10 minutes on where communism and communist ideals, dialectical materialism, dialectical historicism fits inside China and Russia's governance strategies. How much of this is just, a tendency of authoritarians to want to hold on to power? How much of it is coming from these outside forces and factors around them? I think it's probably a combination of all of those. All of those elements are playing together. But when China looks at Russia, I would say that what probably is most front of mind is how quickly the Soviet Union collapsed. And China has spent quite a bit of its academic time studying the collapse of the Soviet Union and trying to put into place safeguards against the rapid fall of a one-party system. And that's probably where Xi and Putin find the most common ground. Putin obviously, came out of that system, the Soviet system, and probably has his own set of recommendations for how to avoid something like that happening again in the future. Xi Jinping would certainly be interested in discussing and digesting, Russia's experience in that regard. So I think that that's where the two leaderships align.
Thank you. So if I may ask one more question, one thing that I think may not be obvious being in Japan, looking at the U.S., is how much there's actually still a lot of people-to-people exchange with China. That is not just the trade that is in contrast to what the rhetoric might be, but also, especially at the universities where I teach, there's a lot of Chinese students, and also there's a lot of exchange still at the scholars level. Although I am a bit worried about within the U.S., I see some scholars more hesitant to travel to the U.S., to China for various reasons. But what do you think is the state of the people-to-people exchange, and what kind of things can be accomplished through that to help manage China's rise without war? So what's your take on that level of exchange between China and the U.S.?
I think we're not in a new Cold War. I'm not sure if I mentioned that in my opening remarks, but trade between the two countries, between the U.S. and China, has reached a record high. Obviously, we do have people-to-people exchanges. Those people-to-people exchanges are being somewhat rebuilt in the post-COVID era, and I think it's too early to make a judgment of whether or not they've permanently changed in their nature. After the complete kind of cutoff of international travel that we all experienced as part of this pandemic. I'm not as familiar with the students themselves. I do know that the numbers have gone down quite a bit in terms of Chinese students studying in the U.S. But I'd say on the think tank side, what I'm more concerned about is that we used to have academic and expert exchanges at the Track 2 level, an area that I've spent a lot of my professional career, that were, constructive in that they fed good recommendations and good information about how the other side was thinking about the strategic issues into the policymaking community. So people who took part in Track 2s could go brief sitting policy members policy officials and say, this is what I'm hearing from the Chinese. And that information was taken in and digested and used to further, the creation of each side's own policy. The strategic distrust between the two sides has really eroded the ability of Track 2 to make inroads in the policy community. So rather than being seen as a constructive way to reality test new ideas, to get information about what the other side is thinking, I'm seeing more and more of a closed door between Track 2 and Track 1. Instead of, taking in this information and digesting it, policymakers are often accusing the people in Track 2 of repeating talking points from the other side. So that's probably where I'm most concerned about people-to-people exchanges. Of course, where I stand depends on where I sit, but from my perspective, I think people-to-people exchanges do need to be invested in by the official level in order to have the most impact on doing something as important as managing China's rise without war.
Thank you very much. I think we had an excellent, deep discussion. It was a wonderful event. Thank you so much. We're so proud that you're the leading ASP's way in New York, but we're very proud that you're a member of our Asia Society larger family, and that we are very happy that you were able to make it all the way to Tokyo, and that I think we all owe you a big round of applause for your contribution this morning. Thank you so much, Rorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Takako.